Hello there, and welcome to Nerdist News Talks Back. We're live on Nerdist YouTube, Geek and Sundry's Twitch, and Alpha. I'm Dan Casey, and today, heartbreaking news coming out of the world of pop culture. Comic book legend and larger-than-life personality Stan Lee has passed away. Like many of the characters he created, the Fantastic Four, SpiderMan, the X-Men, the Avengers, Stan Lee was bigger than the page. And on today's Talks Back, we're going to look back and remember the legacy of one of the greatest comic book creators of all time. So joining me to break all of this down and more is the host of the Wednesday Club, Matt Key.
Hi.
Thanks for joining me.
It's my pleasure to be here, but
yes,
sad circumstances.
We all wish it was under better circumstances, but it's going to be a remembrance celebration of life.
So, in that regard, it is an honor to be here.
Yes.
That I get to do that.
Also joining us today, we have Nerdist Associate Editor Kyle Anderson.
Hello, everybody.
And last but not least, we have the host of the Sending the Wolf podcast and friend of the show, Clark Wolf.
Hey guys, thanks for having me today. Of course, I wish it were under better circumstances, but it's nice to see you all.
Yes, it's good to be here. I wish it was under better circumstances. I'm sorry to be repeating myself. I'm just kind of stunned by today's news. So, folks, it was revealed today by TMZ and later confirmed by several news outlets that the iconic writer Stan Lee has passed away at the age of 95. Now, please note we're going to be monitoring the chat throughout the show. So, if you have a favorite moment from Stan Lee's life or what he meant to you, if you have a special story about him, please share it with us, and we'd love to hear about them. Now, going off of that, I'd like to know, what did Stan Lee mean to you folks?
I mean, like, one of the reasons I really started to fall in love with comics was like hearing his voice in like those all the old cartoons. Like, he's been doing cameos like since they first started doing.
He's the king of cameos.
Yeah, and I remember being like 9 or 10 and being like, "Who's this guy that's in every single one of these cartoons?" And my dad was like, "Oh, that's Stan Lee. He helped." Create, and like my dad didn't really know the history of the contributions. He wasn't a huge comic book guy, but he knew enough to know that, and like that just like there was this weird sort of like fantasy kind of thing that like went off in my head. I was like, the creator of the comic books is in the cartoons? This is amazing. Like, it's just like, that was my first interaction with him, and then I went and started reading comics like from there. Like, I found friends who were reading the comics, and I really got into the X-Men cartoon, and
exactly.
This is fascinating. Like, this guy's dedicated to this, so.
Yeah, that sort of omnipresence has always been one of the special things to me about Stan Lee and Marvel, because he's always just been like the face of it. Like, Disney has Mickey Mouse. Like, he was an ambassador for comics, and just like your welcoming figure. He felt like this like fun uncle almost. And it's weird because he's one of those people that's felt like just a fact of life. Like, he's always going to be there. Like, he's just a given. Like, oh, there will always be a Stan Lee.
Yeah, he's like a weight-bearing support beam.
Yes.
Like, he'll always be here to support everything that we're doing.
Yes.
Yeah, it was sort of like, kind of like Matt, like you just kind of knew that Stan Lee was there, like, and he was always, and I thought he was sort of the representative of Marvel, and then it was later, when I started reading comics as like a teen, that I started realizing, oh, he actually helped create just about all of these great characters, and it's like, you don't get that a lot. You get the figurehead or the person who's in charge to kind of like be the face of it, but it's like, oh, he actually also wrote just about all of these characters too, and was like the ambassador, as Dan was saying. Like, so it's, and he had such great memory and great reverence for his own creations and the input of other people too, and it just kept going. Just the fact that like you can't have or couldn't have an MCU movie without him popping up in it. It was like one of those things. Take a drink the second you see Stan Lee. Like it was part of those movies.
Yeah, I think for me, growing up with movies and TV shows that really focused on superheroes, I definitely was more exposed to the DC of it all. My dad was a huge Superman fan, and so it wasn't until Sam Raimi's SpiderMan, actually, that this sort of came on my radar. And then after living here in Los Angeles for a handful of years and like being a part of this community, Kamikaze, which is now LA Comic Con, was something that I was involved in from the beginning, and that was Stan Lee's, that was was his, and it was such a unique, weird collection of people, which always felt very endearing. And Stan was always around, like he was always physically there. So it was really interesting for me having he always felt very accessible to me in a way. So it's a different perspective, but you know, and certainly going back and learning more about the history of his contributions was also something that came later.
I remember I did a red carpet for this film called, it was the guy from Super Size Me, I forget his name.
Spurlock,
Morgan Spurlock. He did a film about Comic-Con, and Stan Lee was on the red carpet, and it was the first time I've ever really felt starstruck. I was just like, oh, you had a hand in so much of what is important to me, what was so formative for me in terms of like my pop cultural interests, and like I was reading comics, something I shared with my father, so it was like very near and dear to my heart, and I just like, oh my god. And then just seeing him like turn it on, like giving me an Excelsior, like seeing him at conventions like that, he always would make time for fans, and that's something I really appreciated, because a lot of times it can be like a very draining experience, but you could tell he loved it. Now, looking back at Stan Lee's long career in the business, as we mentioned before, he's created some of our favorite superheroes and co-created many of them, including the X-Men, Iron Man, Hulk, Daredevil, so many more. Which of his creations is your favorite? Which one speaks to you the most?
Oh, that's such a good question.
I mean, I think everyone's expecting me to say Doctor Strange, but like, I also don't really count Stan Lee as creating him. Like, that's more of a Ditko thing.
Yeah.
Like, he's even admitted, like, later on, like, I like the character a lot, but that was like 85% Ditko.
Yeah.
You know? So, like, in terms of Stan Lee, I would probably say Spider-Man. Just because, like, Spider-Man, like, as much as the Fantastic Four, like, really kicked off the age of Marvel, like, in the Silver Age, like, Spider-Man was, I think, this sort of like solidifying definition of it. It was because you have this dysfunctional family, but they have each other. Spider-Man, he had Aunt May, but that was kind of it, and she wasn't much help because she was very poor and always in the crosshairs. Like, it was down to Peter Parker, and that was such a definitive move to make the sidekick the hero, but he doesn't have the hero to help him with his problems, so now he's just on his own. And
he has to pay rent. Like unlike all these other characters, like, look, you can love Batman as much as you want, but like that guy never has to work a day in his life. He is set. Peter Parker has to run a scam selling pictures of himself stopping crime so he can eat.
Like, and help his poor Aunt May, who is too old to work and lost Uncle Ben partially because of Spider-Man. Like, you know, like what a character, you know?
And being embedded in the New York City of it all, and just the way that the dialogue, that quippy, snappy dialogue, and the sassy tones. I mean, it's like, I was doing a lot of reading about Stan Lee's history this morning, and yeah, it seems like Spider-Man felt the most personal in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it was sort of, Spider-Man and the X-Men were my two, like, growing up. If it wasn't Batman, it was Spider-Man and the X-Men.
Oh, yeah.
And it was, you know, Bob Kane always kind of, like, made himself out to be Bruce Wayne thereafter, and kind of just lived a very, like, wealthy lifestyle. But then you have Stan Lee, who very much associated himself with Spider-Man as being like, I'm out there, you know, I'm hustling, I'm trying to do what I can to get by.
Always covered in webs.
Yeah, consistently. And I love that. And you know, Spider-Man, I think, having just finished the video game, the PS4 game, and he makes that cameo appearance in the game, and maybe the best cutscene in the movie, or in the game. So that was just really nice to be like, yeah, that is his favorite. Like, you could tell, even this, you know, in video game form, he loves that character so much, or loved that character.
Yeah, as someone who can't stop themselves from making a lot of terrible jokes all the time, always, Spider-Man really spoke to me on a visceral level. So is there something about a Stan Lee character that stands out from other traditional comic book characters to you? Like, is there something that you're like, oh, this is emblematic of something that Stan Lee would create?
Well, I think one of the major things that makes Marvel stand out from other comic book companies is stuff that Stan brought to it, which is that these people are real people.
Yes.
They live in real New York City, like Clark was saying, but they're real people with real problems. They're not these gods that have sort of, like, you know, giant cosmic problems. They're a family that bickers, or there's somebody trying to make rent, or they're oppressed by society because they're just born differently. Like, so many of that, and you know, there's so much depth, and those were written in the 60s. Like those were created way before you might think that kids would be ready to read that stuff. And I think that solidified. That's why Marvel Comics is what it is because of his input and the input of the other people he was working with at the time.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, so oftentimes, historians will say that the Silver Age started with, what was it, Showcase #4 with the Barry Allen Flash.
Yes.
And, like, certainly you can point to that and say, well, that is certainly the rebirth of superheroes, but the defining moment of the Silver Age was Stan Lee, Fantastic Four, like Spider-Man, bringing in the X-Men, just like that Marvel Age of comics. Like, so certainly they didn't start the Silver Age, but like they defined it, and they defined it by, it's sort of like a commentary on what the Golden Age was, and that it was like, here's the Golden Age, and there are all these paragons of might and virtue. And Stan was like, yeah, but you can only take that so far with storytelling. Like, like how many times is Superman going to race around the earth, to do so. I want to see a kid who is struggling to make rent, to like take care of his aunt who like is mourning the loss of his uncle because it's his fault. I want to see like sort of like the civil rights issues like played out on the page. I want to do that.
It's like what he wrote in, I think it was a 1968 Stan Soapbox column. I think he wrote that a story without a message is like a man without a heart.
Yeah.
You just can't have it.
Yeah.
I think too, one of the things that I love about all forms of genre storytelling in general is metaphor, right? Obviously, and using metaphor to talk about real things, and that's something that's always appealed to me about the Marvel characters, that Stan is credited with being involved in and creating was like you guys were saying. I mean, whether it's alcoholism or whether it's gender identity or whether it's pick something, hubris, and it's all there, and it is very human, and these are very human stories, and I think that's the thing that's made them endure so long, because we all want to look to the sky and be different than be more super than we are, but the idea of looking and seeing what regular people are capable of doing if they have that heart and if they believe and they work together. I mean, it is an optimistic message, and I think that, as I was saying earlier, doing some of that reading, I think that was something that was very much associated with Stan Lee over the decades is the optimistic message.
Yeah, well, and like going along with that, like one of the most interesting characters, and I think it's easy to overlook because of like the grandiose other characters he created, but like Iron Man is such a stalwart character, and he was born out of Stan Lee wanting to say, well, you know what, like I'm writing about these poor people who are struggling, and like Reed Richards and like the Richards family, they have money, it's a little more if it's where it's come from. I'm going to take a war profiteer who's a billionaire, and I'm going to make him a hero that you like have heart for. And he did it. And it's like in an age like of Vietnam, when like everyone's hating war and like hippies are in full force, like please stop this. He's like, well, here's a character who you should hate. I'm gonna make you love him. And he humanizes like billionaires and war profiteers, like with one character, and gives them heart, and they're people too, and like nothing was off limits for him in that regard. So I think that was kind of part of his brilliance.
Exactly. Real quick, let's check in with Lee and see what chat has been saying. So, Lee, what do you got for us?
Chat's just full of great stories so far. Jessie Messycat says that Spider-Man made her realize that it's okay for girls to like boy stuff, like superheroes, and she can't thank Stan Lee enough for it. Glenn Coco said that they'll never forget the first time they saw Stan Lee. They had no idea that this would shape their personality so much in life. Leo Costello says they were at Chicago Comic-Con, and they couldn't get an autograph from Stan Lee, so he waited for him outside. Stan Lee gave him a high five and said Excelsior. So just so many great, emotional stories and what this means to them in their life right now.
Awesome. I also saw, I believe it was Zeno Hour in the chat, who called out Stan Lee's legacy of advocating for social justice, advocating for change through the medium of comics, and talking about how that changed comic books for the better. And I just want to say, yes, you are correct. Just look up, he has you'll see it a lot online right now if you go on Twitter. There's an excellent old Stan Soapbox column going around about him calling for the end to bigotry and hatred and the need for more tolerance. So highly recommend checking that out. And along those lines, what was it about Stan Lee, do you think, that made him so special? Why did he stand out more than other writers, artists, creators? I mean, obviously there's these sort of like grandiose character of it all, but like, why do you think he was such a resonant figure?
I think he kind of positioned himself as sort of a man of the people, and that really resonated with. I mean, he always had his Stan soapbox in the back of books, and he would always kind of pop in as the and that became like a kind of a trope of early Marvel Comics too. Is like whoever the publisher was or whoever the editor was would always pop in and say, "Hey, I have a note for you." And so he became a character even just within the comics, and he was always the like when they made that Spider-Man TV show in the '70s, like he was out front and center doing all the press for it and stuff like that. And he just kind of has he used to, especially in the '70s, used to wear those checkered jackets, and that's like I remember seeing so many interviews with him where he would just kind of be big smiley guy with glasses and those crazy jackets, and that's he just always like seemed like he was your buddy who was the kind of keeper of this world, and he was really excited for you to come in. He wasn't like. He didn't seem above any of it. He was always like with you, kind of like excited.
Like Willy Wonka without the moralizing
totally.
elements.
Yeah.
I think like there was something about him where he, like with Bob Kane, creator of Batman, co-creator Batman, Bill Finger, and Jerry Robinson and all those guys like had a hand in it. But like with Stan, it was like so Bob would be like, Batman is mine and I'm rich because of it and I love Batman. But Stan was like, yeah, the Hulk is a great character. Isn't he great, kids?
Yeah.
I love this character. Spider-Man, what a character. Like, he just, like, he loved those creations. And, like, as much as he, like, kind of seemed to take the credit for him solely for himself, like, if you read, like, interviews with him later on in his life and everything, like, it's like, yeah, no, Ditko did almost all of Doctor Strange. I just kind of helped fill in a lot of the dialogue and mold some of the plotting, but yeah, it was mostly Ditko, really. Like, so there was an element of like he knew where the credit was due. I think there was he was a bit of a company man in that way, where he's like I'm the face of Marvel, and Marvel is what's important here. Like, I'll compensate you as best as I can, whatever. Like, we can debate that, for days, but like for him, the characters and the stories from Marvel came first, and it had nothing to do with their commercial value to him. Like, he obviously was invested in that and wanted it, but his commercial value came from how much he actually really loved these characters and believed in these characters more than, whoa, Batman's making me a lot of money. I really like Batman.
Yeah.
I would also say, this might seem like a strange thing to point out, but I think it's really important, the concept of the shared universe. Because it seems like we take it for granted now, right? Because Marvel has been doing this iteration of movies for the last decade. But the idea that Stan Lee, in his tenure at Marvel, overseeing the brand, kind of was the one who was like, yeah, they'll run into each other every now and again, and like this whole big picture, storytelling. Like, that's something that every movie studio and every TV network is trying to attain, and he, I think, is rightly credited with being the one who's like, no, we're going to do this. It's a brilliant, it's a really creative way to tell stories, financially, but also creatively. And so I think it's the idea that he pushed for that so many decades ago, and now it's the thing that everybody wants is pretty remarkable.
It was at the inception of the Marvel Universe when he created it. Like, it wasn't like he was like, I can't wait to put Fantastic Four and Spider-Man together, but within like 4 or 5 issues, he was like, oh wait, I mean, they're both in New York. Why aren't they hanging together?
Exactly.
Like, so it was at the very
Statistically,
inception.
this should happen.
Yes.
But like Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, all the Golden Age DC heroes, that didn't really start happening until much later.
Well,
in
it was
their
always
runs,
so much
you know,
more
like,
amorphous too. Like, where is Metropolis in relation to Gotham, in relation to Star
Exactly.
City? Like, we didn't know
We
until
didn't
way
know.
later where anything was in relation to
You
each
saw
other.
them come into contact with Justice League,
Exactly.
which does predate the Avengers,
Yes.
but you'd also, like you're saying, they'd be in these separate cities that weren't grounded in reality, like Metropolis, Gotham. They're all fictional places, whereas, like, with Marvel, like, oh, they're all in New York.
Yeah.
Like, wow, there's a lot of supervillains in New York. Also,
Or New York.
I know. Look, it's still a nicer place to live than Gotham, at least from how it looks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The sun comes out once in a while.
It's a bit more of a shining city.
Yeah. So one of the things that Stan Lee, one of the biggest changes that he brought to comics, as we mentioned, was having heroes with realistic flaws, these sort of characteristics that felt grounded in reality. Why do you think that was important to change from the typical sort of like archetypal perfect superhero, that paragon of justice that we were discussing earlier?
I just feel like it was a way of, bringing the kids, like the readers in, like these are real problems that you'll probably deal with. So why not let's have these superheroes that you already kind of idolize deal with them? And it's the same thing as, having a big brother or something like that tell you, hey, you know what? I went through this too, kind of thing. I think that was just such a brilliant idea, especially because the Fantastic Four, which kind of, was the birth of Marvel Comics, could have just been a team book and it kind of had none of that kind of angst going on. But pretty soon he just started being like, yeah, this guy has this problem. These people are flawed, and the readers are flawed, and so that they will see. It's a way to get issues into things that young kids would read, and maybe their parents would just kind of go, oh, it's under the code, so it's fine. But they would sneak in all that stuff.
Now, another big change that Stan Lee brought to the industry was what's known as the Marvel method. It revolutionized the way the comics are made. So what is the Marvel method for people out there who don't know, and why was it so important?
So the Marvel method it was a necessity for Stan Lee because
writing 300 books a month.
Yeah. So a lot of it, like the way it had worked in the past is that the writer would write it, and then the artist would draw it, and then there would be some edit passes back and forth, and then it would go out. But with Marvel, Stan Lee was the only writer. He was it, and that's all they could afford at the time. And he can't draw, so he's got to have his stable of artists. So he's got Jack Kirby and Ditko, and every once in a while Romita, but not initially. And it's just like, well, I've got 10 stories I've got to write this month. Here's the plot. Go draw that. Bring it back to me, and I'll put the dialogue in it. And essentially what he was saying was, I trust the artists to be the storytellers as much as I am. So like there's always that really famous SpiderMan that everyone references, where like he's like under the weight and everything like that. Like Ditko did that almost exclusively. Like Stan Lee wrote like he's under rubble, he's struggling. There's these kinds of things going through his head. This is what he's thinking about. But Ditko is the one who plotted out the artwork and made it what it was and made it that grand moment that it was. But it took Stan Lee trusting Ditko to do that, to get to that point. And that had not really existed in the comic book medium up until that point. So essentially, he would write like 2 pages of plot summary. The artists would take that and sketch it out, draw it out, do the layouts for it, give it back to Stan with suggested dialogue sometimes. And then he'd be like, no, yes, here's the actual dialogue. Here's, like, famously with Spider-Man, Ditko was such like an on-rond kind of person. He had moments where like Spider-Man would be like swinging by protesters, and his dialogue would be, what are all these kids doing? Like, get
Tell
to
them John Galt says, suck it.
yeah, essentially. And Stan Lee would be like, nah, Spider-Man would be with the kids.
Yeah.
He would be one of the hippies. Like, so he would rewrite the dialogue as like, yeah, kids, let's change the world together. And it's just like, oh, that's so Stan Lee. Like, that's such a Stan Lee thing, So that's the Marvel. I think I described it.
And I think that is an accurate summation. Now, we also know of Stan Lee's fascination. Everyone loves seeing him as a cameo character in Marvel movies. He was in so many movies, including Teen Titans Go to the movies this summer. So of all of his on-screen cameo appearances, what was your favorite?
This is a tough one.
It's tough, yeah.
I have mine. I thought about it. The Watcher. I loved him as because just on a metaphorical level, it fits so well that the Watchers would come to this one person for all of the stories of all the superheroes, so it's like, yeah, so this one time I was delivering this package to Reed Richards. It's just like, of course he knows all of them, and of course the Watchers want to hear his stories. But also on top of that, it's just like, how random is that? Yeah. Like just in terms of cameos, wait, the Watchers are talking to Stan Lee? Like, what?
Also,
this
just
is crazy.
Seeing them on the screen for the first time, I was like, oh, cool.
That's pretty awesome. That's so cool.
Which refresh my memory. Do you remember which movie that was?
It was Guardians 2.
It was Guardians 2.
It was as they were going through the weird gates and whatever, and
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Their faces were.
Was he in X-Force and Deadpool too?
He was in Deadpool. He was in Deadpool as he was like the strip
right?
club DJ.
Yeah.
I don't recall Deadpool 2.
I think
he was in that
Deadpool
one.
2. He's not in that.
He's in that. He's in the teaser trailer they did for it, like that 3-minute one where Isn't someone like bleeding out in like a phone booth or something?
Yeah, that's
like
right.
That?
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of my favorites. I think it is Amazing Spider-Man. Actually, it's one of my favorite parts of that movie. Is when Peter Parker is fighting Kurt Connors, the Lizard, in the school library, and
Yes.
Stanley's the janitor, just sweeping, just sweeping.
Yes.
It's such like a wonderful little moment. You're like, I know what you're doing there.
Yeah.
I know what you're doing.
With
Yeah.
his big giant headphones on.
Exactly.
Yeah. I really liked, like the first X-Men movie, there's a part where they're on the beach and somebody walks, and I think he's the hot dog vendor or something like that in
Yeah.
that movie. And that was the first, because I was like, I know who that is. Ha ha ha. Like everyone. I had to tell my mom, and she's like, I know who Stanley is. But that one always stuck out to me because that was like one of the first times I was like, that's a cameo that I recognize because of my dumb nerdiness. So that one will always kind of stand out.
It's kind of amazing too how he sort of took over the cameo. Like I can only think of Alfred Hitchcock being the other one where you actually look and you're like, okay,
Yeah.
where is he? There's an expectation, and we all knew that if this was a Marvel movie or associated,
We could always expect that, yeah.
exactly. So it was kind of fun that he, in addition to all the things that he will be remembered for his cameos as well.
Oh, I get to amend mine as well. I think my favorite might be in Age of Ultron when he gets drunk as hell on Asgardian liquor.
yes. where he's like, we fought in Normandy, hand it
Yeah.
over. And then like they have to drag him out. He's like, la, 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 la.
Excelsior.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, I think it's pretty unanimous in chat. Everyone I see is typing "mall rats" in all caps.
Oh,
Really an
yes.
unforgettable one.
Yeah.
So before we part, is there any last thing that any of you would like to say about Stan Lee?
Man.
I mean, I think. Oh, I'm sorry. Please.
No, you go ahead.
I just very quickly would say that Stan Lee was a complicated character, much like his characters, and I think there's going to be a legacy that follows him that is just going to be so fascinating. But the change in pop culture that came as a result of his leadership and his creativity is undeniable.
Yeah.
I mean, he saved the comic book medium in a lot of ways. Like, there's a lot can be said about, like, we all have our jobs because he created Fantastic Four. Because comic books were a dying medium when he came in, like, because of the comics code and everything. And then he found a way to thrive with, like, he took what DC was doing that under the comics code, made it even better, and then thrived within it, and then challenged the very code in the early 70s that he helped. Like he saved comic books in America, certainly, for better or for worse. And I think a lot of us, sorry, I'm trying to not like cry. Like a lot of us owe so much to him, and what he did and what he created. And it seems silly to be like, oh, he created, these characters who run around in spandex and save the day, and it's all fictional and silly and over the top. But like, Doctor Strange has saved me so many times from my own depression, and just being able to escape into the X-Men, and like the X-Men taught me about like inclusion and about bigotry and about like, I can remember like being raised in a very Christian area and constantly questioning like, why are people so mean to homosexual people? Like, they're just people like the mutants are in the X-Men. Like, that was my childhood, and certainly Claremont was writing those. It wasn't Stan Lee writing that, but Stan Lee started that conversation. And I don't know, I owe a lot of who I am to his creations. So
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think we it's easy to be like, oh, he, toward the end of his life, was just kind of that guy who popped up in all these comic book movies. They're the biggest movies of all time. They're the biggest movies going right now for the past decade. 20 years, they've been the standout genre in film. And it started because, as you said, he saved one medium and is now kind of saving
And
a different
has
one.
kind of, transformed another one.
Yeah.
And I just want to take a moment to say thank you, Mr. Lee. You may be gone, but you will never be forgotten. Thank you for the years and years of stories, for the creations, everything you've meant to me and to my family and to all of us here. And because you are a better writer than any of us, we thought we'd end on some of your words and pull something from a Stan Soapbox column, specifically the letters page of Avengers number 74 from March of 1970. From time to time, we receive letters from readers who wonder why there's so much moralizing in our mags. They take great pains to point out that comics are supposed to be escapist reading and nothing more. But somehow, I can't see it that way. It seems to me that a story without a message, however subliminal, is like a man without a soul. In fact, even the most escapist literature of all, old-time fairy tales and heroic legends, contained moral and philosophical points of view. At every college campus where I may speak, there's as much discussion of war and peace, civil rights, and the so-called youth rebellion as there is of our Marvel mags, per se. None of us lives in a vacuum. None of us is untouched by the everyday events around us. Events which shape our stories just as they shape our lives. Sure, our tales can be called escapist, but just because something's for fun doesn't mean we have to blanket our brains while we read it. Excelsior. Stan Lee. Thank you so much to our panel for joining us today. You can find Matt Key Wednesday nights on the Wednesday Club over on Geek and Sundry's Twitch and Alpha. And Clark, the second season of your podcast is about to debut this month, correct?
That's right. It will be out at the last Tuesday of this month on the 27th, and I'm recording some episodes. I'm recording one tonight, actually.
Fantastic.
So lots of great guests. Hopefully a lot of these gentlemen at the table will come on the show. But yeah, so I'm really excited. It's coming soon.
Amazing. So get that wherever fine podcasts are downloaded.
Indeed.
What's the name of it?
It's called Sending the Wolf.
And folks, that's it for today's episode of Nerdist News Talks Back. Thank you so much again to our panel and to those of you in chat for joining us today and sharing your remembrances as we remember the life of Stan Lee. Be sure to tune in tomorrow for another all-new episode of Nerdist News Talks Back at 12 p.m. Pacific on YouTube, Alpha, and Twitch. Have a great day, be kind to each other, and as always, Excelsior.